Thanks very much, Mark. Good morning, everybody. I'm Helen Blenkinsop, writing as A.A. Abbott. As Mark said, I'm based in Bristol and I've written 5 thrillers about a vodka business in Birmingham with occasional forays to London and a fictional former Soviet Union country. I'm joined by Debbie Young and Jo Ullah, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a minute. We'll be talking about crime fiction set in the city versus crime fiction set in the countryside. But I know that later on, at 4 o'clock, there will also be a talk from crime writer Elizabeth Ducey, who writes about an extremely interesting international and jet-setting crime scene. So if you do have a chance, please try to get to Elizabeth's session later on too. I'm going to kick off by asking Debbie and Jo to introduce themselves, and then Jo has kindly offered to tell you a bit about all the books that the 3 of us write, because as well as writing her own, Jo reads loads, and she's read every single one that Debbie and I have written, and hundreds and thousands of books besides. Then I'll quiz Debbie and Jo about their thoughts on countryside crime fiction versus books set in the city. And if you type your questions in the chat box, after 20 minutes or so, Mark can put those questions to us and give us an even more thorough grilling. So first, Debbie, please tell us about yourself. Debbie.
Thank you. I'm at the opposite end of the spectrum in a way to A.A. Abbott, in that I write exclusively about village settings. I write cosy mysteries, full of fun, set in a fictional village inspired by the one that I live in the Cotswolds. So I'm actually, although I've got lots of connections with Bristol, I'm actually 20 miles north of Bristol in a beautiful village, Hawkesbury Upton, on the Cotswold Way.
Marvellous. So Jo, please could you introduce yourself and give us a quick summary of all our books as you thoughtfully analyse them all.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jo Ullah. I've only published 2 books so far. My first novel, The Locksmith, incorporates both city and country living. And then my second book, Sweet Dreams, is set just in Bristol. I enjoy writing about both of those settings because I was brought up in the countryside and I understand farming and country living, but I've also lived in a city since I was about 18 years old. So I understand that side, and I like the compromise between the 2 different settings. That's me.
Great. You did offer to give us a little bit of
yeah, okay.
One's books as well. So
yes. So looking first at A.A. Abbott's Trail series, they're set in London and Birmingham. The characters work in competition with each other, but they are prepared to ally if that suits their own ends. And though cities are generally impersonal places, people make micro communities, like gangsters will come together at a small community, and business partnerships. But those are not necessarily to be trusted because people are just looking to suit themselves at the end of the day. Helen's books reflect the city environment, fast-paced. The characters are dynamic and entrepreneurial, and like Brummies, they're friendly but capable of a cynical sense of humour. Also, like cities, the characters come from diverse different backgrounds and a mix of communities. And you can get away with a lot more in the impersonal city setting. Whereas Debbie Young's books, the Sophie Sayers Village Mysteries, and now the St. Bride's series, which sometimes overlap with characters from the St. Bride's Visiting the Village, which is set in Wenderby Barrow, a fictional village created by Debbie, and quite similar to the one that she lives in Hawkesbury Upton. Villages are quite small places and all the characters know each other. The pace of life is slower. It's a life of community and sharing, and characters are aware of and accept each other's foibles. This is reflected in Debbie's books with a gentle and affectionate humour. Things out of the ordinary tend to stand out, and wrongdoing, such as murder, is greeted with shock. Villages tend to be more monocultures, less diverse than cities. And my own books, I like the impersonal anonymity of cities where anything can happen. Bristol in particular is buzzing with art and music scene. And my first book, The Locksmith, incorporates both town and country because city girl, Jude, is hoping to show her children what she sees as real living in the countryside, but encounters the harshness of the country reality, which is survival of the fittest. So there we go.
Thanks, Jo. I hope that gives everybody a flavour for the differences between our books and also the different ways in which we've treated rural and city life. I'd now like to ask Debbie if she consciously chose to set her books in the countryside. Debbie, would you mind?
Sure. Yes, it was a very, very purposeful choice because I wanted to celebrate the sense of community that I found living in a small village. I've lived here for nearly 30 years now, but I come from suburban London and I've lived and worked in cities. I worked in the centre of Bristol for a long time, I've worked in central London, and I've never been happier than living in a small community. I realise that to a lot of people who have also spent all their time in cities or in the suburbs, they don't really realise that places like this still exist. And I wanted to raise awareness, not quite doing a sort of a tourist information job, because that's not what it's about, but I wanted to just celebrate and perpetuate in my small way the kind of community that I'm living in now. Although I would hasten to add, we haven't had any murders in the real village where I live, as far as I know, yet.
That's quite reassuring. Having read some of your books, people have sometimes died quite horribly. Not often, I have to say, because you describe yourself as the reluctant murderer, don't you? That's
yeah, I do find it. I find it increasingly hard to kill people. I recognise that the small, close community, or a relatively close community of a village, and even more so with my new series, which is set in a boarding school, which is almost sort of convent-like in terms of the way it encapsulates people. I realise that in the sort of Christie-esque tradition, Agatha Christie-esque and all that lot, it's a very good setting for a murderous kind of story. But I'm moving more towards gentler mysteries, which don't actually require anyone to lose their lives in the process. And in fact, in the St Bride series, particularly because it's in a school setting and I don't want to have anything terrible happening in a boarding school or in any kind of school, I'm not having murders there at all. Although in my next, the next novel that I'm writing in the Dorothy Sayers series does start in the village school with somebody finding a dead body in the lost property cupboard of the primary school. But it's after the end of term, so the kids aren't involved.
Oh, that's reassuring. It's good that there's nothing to scare the children, at least. Moving on to Jo, by contrast, Jo, I feel that some quite grim stuff happens in your books in both the city and the countryside. And when you write about the countryside in particular, in your book, The Locksmith, a happy Bristol family go to a farm to have what they expect to be a lovely, cheery, sunny holiday, and it's not quite like that. What makes you talk about the dark side of rural life, nature read in tooth and claw? What draws you to do that?
I think that, as I said, people can be themselves more in the countryside. They're not being looked at with a critical eye, and equally they can develop some unusual characteristics. You hear stories of people who've been living in the same area for many, many generations, and they've developed their own sense of law and creed, and therefore when you step in and you try and change that, you might be met with a little more resistance than you expected.
So did you deliberately set out when you were writing The Locksmith to contrast Bristol and the kind of happy, laid-back bohemian lifestyle that the family have?
Yes, I think I did, because the character Jude, she's a bit of an eco-warrior, and she sees herself as wanting to be part of nature. But although she originally was brought up in a small town herself, she's kind of lost that affinity with nature, and she's forgotten that the reality of nature is actually quite harsh. So when she goes into the countryside, she's staying in her mother-in-law's farm. The farm is no longer really working. And I grew up in farming community, and people do tend to sort of make do and cobble things together, bits of old bale of twine and things like that. And they have a sense of, what's the word I'm looking for? There's no health and safety. It's up to you. If you fall in a slurry pit and drown, that's your foolhardy work. I mean, at school we had slides and talks about how to survive 10 ways you could die on a farm, because it was quite common. And people were driving tractors from an early age, and you know, if you got bitten by the dog, that was your fault. You looked at it the wrong way rather than the other way around. Whereas in the city, people are cosseted by health and safety everywhere, but then again, there's an awful lot that can be lurking just around the corner, and things happen with the swiftness of a snake that you might not get in the countryside. So it's a good contrast between the two.
What was your purpose in choosing different settings for the two books, Jo?
Bristol, because I really like the arty scene in Bristol. It's almost like a sort of slightly posher Glastonbury, I suppose, in a way. You get some quite unusual types here. And I particularly wanted to write the area I wrote in because it's based on where I was born, and the house that they go to is an actual house, which is so old it's in the Doomsday Book. And the people who lived there, they were my closest neighbours, so I used to trot across the fields to visit them. And they had a flagstone they'd lift, and they showed me the tunnel there that ran from the house down to the church, which is what I wanted to bring into the story.
Lovely. So very much set around personal experience.
Yes.
Obviously, those events, as described in The Locksmith, and presumably in your Bristol-based book, Sweet Dreams, didn't actually happen, bless you.
No, Sweet Dreams was much more of a what-if situation. I did do care work, and I thought it was interesting that people can go around as a care worker. You can enter people's homes. They don't really know you. They just have to trust you. Although the character of Astrid, who is the care worker, is a kind person, she's actually being pursued around her visits by somebody who isn't so kind. And I thought that Bristol, because it's quite a small city, you can actually walk across it quite easily in a day. And it has a nice mixture of old and modern. I mean, you've got quite old buildings which are covered in very modern graffiti. Everything is ever changing all the time. And yet the solidity of places like the Central Library, which is where Astrid first comes to notice, or rather be noticed by the person who's following her. The Central Library is one of her favourite parts of Bristol, and she's there all the time. But the library itself is actually quite a creepy building sometimes. You can be in there and you can feel a bit like what's lurking behind the next stack of books. It's a very old building, so I do wonder about the odd people who might have died while sitting in the corner and nobody noticed for several hours.
That's a good point. I mean,
I'd just say that not all libraries are like that. Yeah, I'll just throw that in.
Yeah, good point. We mustn't diss libraries, as the library has kindly hosted the Lit Fest all day. Cities do have a lot of people coming and going, don't they? And perhaps more acceptance of eccentricity. I guess it's people that make places when all's said and done. I think if I've learnt one thing, it is that people do make places. And when I write about Birmingham, I try to bring out the fact that Brummies are hardworking and warm-hearted and witty and cynical. And I really like the people to shine as well as the place. Having said all that, Debbie, I think you've got some quite eccentric country characters in your cozy mysteries.
I have, yes. I love inventing them, and I have to say, I mean, some of the characters that I know in real life in the village, you know, you perhaps couldn't make up in the nicest possible way. But yeah, I think the characters are part of the fun. And I think also in the kind of setting, the community settings that I'm writing about, where pretty much everybody accepts everybody for who they are, it's much easier for eccentrics to shine out and be noticed, rather than in a city setting where everybody is much more anonymous. Although, ironically, less anonymous, because in a city setting you've got all the security cameras watching you all the time, which you just don't have in a small community like the ones that I write about. Although you do actually, in the school that I write about, there are security cameras, but not in the village setting that I'm writing about. So I have a security character called Max Security in the school series, who's keeping all the girls in the school safe. That's not his real name, but he can't tell you that or he'd have to kill you.
Nice. I would like to ask whether you feel crimes are different in the city and countryside. Because personally, I feel it's the same passions, the same murders, but just different places. But I do suspect that Debbie and Jo have got other views. Debbie, what do you think?
Well, I have to say that there isn't actually much noticeable crime where I live. There aren't, you know, headlines every day of murders and attacks and all that sort of thing. I mean, it's one of the places why I love living here so much. You know, it feels a very safe community. And as you said, when something does go wrong, that's why it comes as more of a surprise.
Yes, I guess some places do have more murders than others. And in real life, I came across an example of that when I was living in Bristol, round the corner from a house where a murder was committed, and it was the murder of Jo Yates, which you might have heard about.
Oh,
It was quite a high profile at the time, and it was in all the newspapers. And where I lived, people were actually quite nervous. You know, the police were advising women not to go out on their own after dark, and as at that time of year, dark fell at about 4 o'clock. This wasn't really nice. And I was working in London at the time, so I went into work after Christmas on my first day back, and I said, hey, guess what? You know, really exciting, there's been a murder around the corner from where I live. And all my colleagues, without exception, were saying, oh, really? You know, murders happen in London all the time. So I guess
that was particularly interesting, actually, because Christopher Jeffries, who was the landlord of Jo Yates, he was flagged up by the press, wasn't he, just because he looked different and unusual, and everybody vilified him and decided he was the murderer, until they found out it was somebody else completely different.
Yes, yeah.
Horrible. Like the ultimate real life red herring.
Yeah.
Labelled as the weird landlord, and actually somebody who is well liked locally, and nobody who lived in the area thought that Christopher Jeffries had done it, and they were right, which is good. Yeah. I wonder if we could perhaps broaden our focus to other writers now. I've especially enjoyed books set in London written by the likes of J.K. Rowling, who writes her crime stories as Robert Galbraith, as you know. Ruth Rendell's books, like The Keys to the Street, they really make me feel like I'm walking through those city streets. And I wondered if Jo and Debbie, you had the same feeling about other writers' books. Maybe we could start with Jo on this occasion.
Yeah, I read a lot of Nikki French. I really like the pace of Nikki French, but recently I discovered a series that they'd written about a Frida Klein series, which is Monday through to Sunday. And what they did in these series, which they don't do so much and with their other books, is they focused very much on her character. And I devoured the whole series. They've just recently brought out a new one, which I can't wait to read, because you subtly get to know the character Frida Klein. And London is very much one of the characters in the book, because she likes to walk the rivers, the hidden rivers, which have been paved over. So she does these very extensive walks across London. And I used to live in London years ago, and I couldn't imagine walking as much as she does. So she really brought it alive, and I enjoyed that side of it.
Yeah, I read a book by a Birmingham writer called Colin Ward, and that was a crime thriller set in Birmingham. And without giving too much away, the way that the killer got around did involve certain secret pathways that practically everyone in Birmingham would know about, but if you didn't come from the city, you wouldn't have any idea. And that was quite fascinating too.
I think the my favourite writer, in lots of ways, but particularly for the way that she uses setting, is Dorothy L Sayers, who wrote a number of crime stories with the famous Lord Peter Wimsey, and each had a very different setting, which almost becomes like a character in each novel, and is really important to the atmosphere of the book and the type of the murder and the mood of the murder. And I think the one that is really her masterpiece is The Nine Tamers, which is set in the Norfolk Fens, in a small village, and the 9 tailors are actually the bells in a church tower, and the mystery centres around the church and the bell tower. And I've just started bell ringing on the strength of that. So I'm hoping to use a similar setting, but in a different part of the country for a story in future. But she's also got a wonderful one that's set in London, in an advertising office called Murder Must Advertise, which gives you a lovely flavour both of the period and of because she was writing contemporary novels in the 30s, of how it was to live in 1930s, 1940s London. It's wonderful. 1920s, 30s and 40s London. It's rather wonderful.
That sounds fascinating. Bell ringing is no end to your talent, Debbie.
Yeah, in fact, one of my fellow bell ringers has keeps suggesting storylines to me as well, and that's living in a small community now, where you know, pretty much a lot of people know me. I do get people coming up to me and suggesting stories, suggesting crime, suggesting scenes that they've seen in the village that might end up in my novels, which is rather fun. So I've got quite a lot of ideas in my ideas book for future reference.
Helen, I've got excuse me, I've got a few questions stacked up. If we're all right to just throw some of those in at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please do, Mark. Fire away.
Okay, we have 10 minutes of this session left, so if we just fly through the answers to these, that would just be perfect. So Susan asks, Debbie, are your real life neighbours convinced that they are thinly disguised characters in your novels?
Well, one of my friends said to me, well, I've only recognised one person so far. And I thought, oh no, you're not meant to recognise anybody. I thought I'd made them all up. I have had requests from people to be featured in them, and in fact I've offered as a prize in the local PTA pledge auction the opportunity to have a character named after you in one of my books, and you get to choose whether whether you're a goodie or a baddie as well, which I think is quite fun. Perfect,
because Peter had also asked, had you had requests from villagers to be victims or murderers in the Sophie Sayer books? As a sort of perverse notoriety. So that answers that question perfectly. Jo, Susan also asked, do you think a lot of the drama of your books comes from fish out of water, country people surviving in the city and vice versa, given what you said about different dangers in the two environments?
Yes, I think so. I think if you don't really know the city, it's easy to feel threatened. And equally, if you don't really understand the countryside, you feel like you're sticking out like a sore thumb wherever you go, and you're going to be noticed. I've had occasions, for instance, ages ago when I lived in Sherborne in Dorset, going out to a pub with a friend of mine. We walked in and the whole place went silent, and they all turned around in their stools and stared at us. And it was very difficult then to walk up to the bar and say, can I have a half of whatever you recommend? And knowing that your conversation is being listened to. So, yeah.
Debbie, Gretchen asks, your favourite character to write, male or female, goodie or baddie?
That's a nice question, Gretchen. I guess I don't think anybody is wholly bad or wholly good in my books, and I like writing the more eccentric characters, whether they're male or female. And I also like writing the older people. So I've got somebody who's about 90, a next door neighbour to the protagonist in Sophie Sayers series. And I really like writing the wise old people. But I also like writing the reprobates, who are minor characters. So Billy, who is he's in probably about 80, and he's sort of like the heckler, always in the pub and the bookshop and so forth, causing gentle trouble, and I just make myself laugh really writing that sort of character.
I love your shopkeeper, the one who always gets the words muddled up.
Yeah, the local Mrs. Malaprop, and she keeps her shop stocked in alphabetical order so everyone can find things. I mean, can you imagine? Although sometimes going around a big Tesco's, I think, oh, I ought to be following her system.
And the last question in this list is for all of you. Anne asks, have you found that lockdown has had an effect? Last question, there's another one. Have you found that lockdown has had an effect on your writing output? Any of you?
For the first couple of weeks of lockdown, I was really restless, which is bizarre because I work from home, I write full time, and writing at home is sort of normal life for me generally. But I found it very unsettling, and it took me 2 or 3 weeks to adjust when I wasn't writing much at all. And I decided I had to get a grip, and so I set a deadline. I don't know if you know, there's a way that you can set up a book on the various distributors so that it commits you to publishing by a certain date as a pre-order. And so I thought, right, I'm going to put my next book up for 1st of July as a pre-order, and that made me get on with it because I daren't not have it ready for readers who had ordered it and were waiting for it to come in their inbox at that time.
It's very brave, Debbie.
I've done it though, I finished it, so that's all right.
What about Helen or Jo? Have you found it's any different?
For me, it's been a different time anyway, because I've had to cope with my mother dying during the lockdown, so that has had an effect on my writing output, as you might expect that it would. And I think lockdown in many ways has brought us closer to our families, but in some ways it's separated us from the people that we loved, and I'm afraid that that's what's been going on for me. And it's interesting that I've written in my books about characters losing parents and the impact it has on them, but I don't think until it happens to you that you really know exactly what people are going through. So I'm sure I'll learn from this. But lockdown hasn't really been the most positive time for me, I'm afraid.
I think that applies to a lot of people.
Yeah, sorry to put a downer on it.
No, that's fine. Jo.
Yeah, I've been working on my 3rd novel, which is called Echoes of Minerva, and I felt that I didn't really have a proper grasp of the timeline that was going on because it goes over several years. So I thought I'll go in there and I'll really nail down the timeline and I'll work it all out properly, plot it properly. And then I realised that a major plot point was probably going to happen in lockdown. So I suddenly had to think about how I was going to harness that and make it part of an important part, or whether to just pretend it never happened. So
I'm going to throw in one more question. We've just got time for some very quick responses to this one, I think. Peter asks, what are the pros and cons of writing standalone books as opposed to a series? Any of you?
I write standalone at the moment because I haven't thought of a decent series, but I have got a series tweaking at my subconscious, so that might be next. Helen, you're doing it the other way around, aren't you?
Yes, I wrote a couple of standalone books, then a series, and now I'm going back to a standalone book. I think that with a series, you can really get immersed in people's lives for a period of years, and that's quite interesting. But it does tie you down in that then you're expected to keep going with the series when really you might be having ideas for something else. So the book I'm writing now, I've been itching to write for years and years and years, and I'm only writing it now because I managed to finish the series last year.
Yeah, I agree with that, Helen. That it does become, you become a bit hoist by your own petard if you have a good series running and people are sort of asking for the next book and giving you ideas for the next book as well. Then you do become a bit of a slave to it. And at the very outset, when I started writing my Sophie Sayers series, I said, right, it's going to be 7 books, no more. Going to run from the sort of course of a village year from one summer to the next. And that's it. So I taken my cue from television series as much as books, where you see popular series really crumble when they start running too many series, too many follow-up programs, whereas the more masterful ones like 40 Towers, you know, famously restricted its number of episodes. But I have been persuaded to write an 8th book in the Sophie Sayers series, and I'm going to have some spin-offs as well, which will be sort of standalones but using characters from the series. But one of the things that I really like about writing series is that you can have, it gives you longer to develop the characters, and so I've got character arcs that are spanning the course of the whole series of what will be 8 books. So the characters will really change and grow from the very first one to the last one. So it's all, you're kind of multitasking with those different subplots really, and that's great fun. But another good reason to write a series is that you don't have to reinvent absolutely everything every time. So you've got your setting, you've got your main characters, but also I introduce new characters in each book, in each series, to make sure that it remains fresh and keeps interesting. So you end up with, I mean, I've just written the 6th book now, and I've now got this enormous cast of characters. Not all appear in every book, but it does start to become quite a management challenge, I think, keeping track.
Perfect, thank you. I'll have to stop you there. We have less than a minute left, just enough time to say if you want to register for any more talks today, please email the library. There is still time. Grab the links from the chat to either donate or to go to any of the authors' websites, and in what time is remaining before this session closes, please show your appreciation in whatever microphone muted way you choose to Jo Ullah, A.A. Abbott and Debbie Young. Thank you very much for all of you.
Thank you very much.